This is the day the Lord has made. We should truly rejoice in it and be glad. Now, all of us have sad times in our lives. That's understandable. But the keynote of every believer has to be joy. Because no matter what else is happening in the world and in our lives, there's a basic truth that remains. Christ has died, Christ is risen, and Christ will come again. And he's with us on this great journey. When we look around us, we could think that death is triumphing everywhere. The first reading talks about death not being really a part of the will of God. We see people slaughtering others in the name of God. We see what was once called common sense and common decency now looked upon as ignorance and intolerance. We see a world in which what was once just taken for granted to be right is now considered wrong. And what was just taken for granted as being wrong is now taken as something good and right and wholesome. But nevertheless, we rejoice because none of that changes the truth that Christ has died, Christ is risen, and Christ will come again. And this helps us cut through all the smog of lies, half-truths, and deceptions. It gives us a sense of who we are and who we're called to be. And what a joy that is for us. Now, over the centuries, everything that could possibly happen to the church has already happened. And guess what? The church is still here around the world telling the story of Jesus and his life-giving message. His life-giving power. In Asia and Africa, the church is flourishing and becoming ever more vibrant as the gospel sinks into the hearts and minds and souls of the people. In Europe, unfortunately, the continent has become more and more soulless as it turns away from its spiritual roots. The European Union has a so-called constitution, which is unreadable, of about 500 pages of legal contracts and commitments. They don't use the word God in all those 500 pages once. And yet there would be no Europe if there hadn't been godly people forming it, laying its foundations, building it up, bringing about an identity of all those people who were once called Christians there in Europe. In our own journey, we thank God and rejoice in the faith we've been given and the faith that God sustains in our hearts. At one point, St. Paul says in Romans chapter 12, do good to those that are really treating you rotten. This will really heap hot coals on their heads. Why are you being so happy? You should be beaten down. You should be gloomy. You should be dog-faced. You should be looking like you're a defeated people. Going backwards, laying low, staying out of the public forum, not making any waves, just go away quietly. Why are you so happy? Because Christ has died, Christ is risen, Christ will come again, and Christ continues to pour the Holy Spirit out upon his church. Pope Francis has written a wonderful encyclical, The Gospel of Joy. You can read it for free on the internet, on the Vatican site. And he talks about joy, joy, joy being a part of Christian life. And he says, this joy should cut down of all of our interior bickering and fighting and all the pettiness that so often is a hallmark of the Christian community. Joy should be the keynote of our lives. And then he followed this up just recently with another encyclical on the state of the world and caring for creation that he addresses not simply to us Catholics, but to all people of goodwill. And how do we cherish this wonderful earth that we've been given? How do we care for it? Use it in a way that will sustain one generation after another generation. The earth will always have enough to provide for human needs. It'll never have enough to provide for human greed, because we'll always want more and more and more. But he also challenges us to say, part of the whole ecology of the earth is we as human beings, with our godly role to proclaim the truth of the gospel and to cherish life from the womb to the tomb in a world in which millions upon millions have their lives ended in abortion or killed through euthanasia or slaughtered in endless wars without end. We're here to say every single life is precious. And with that knowledge, we can rejoice in a world that becomes sadder and sadder as it embraces death more and more completely in life. Now, in today's gospel reading, Jesus is preaching by the seaside. People were hungering to hear what he had to say because they had seen lives transformed. Hardened sinners were becoming saints. Ordinary people were giving up tried and true ways of earning a living, like fishing, and finding a different way to live their lives. In desperation, this father, this rabbi, whose daughter was dying at age 12, fights his way through the crowd, throws himself on the ground, and begs for help from Jesus for the sake of his daughter. And many times we have to fight our way through other types of crowds to beg for help for our own family members in their own situations who may be facing spiritual death as well as physical illness. And Jesus says, okay, and he goes pushing his way through the crowd. And one woman who was sick for so many years said, if I could just touch him, I'll be cured. I particularly like this passage because Mark is pretty brutal and much to the point in his writing. It's the shortest gospel, the most condensed gospel. And I compare this passage with the way Luke covered it. Luke, being a physician, when he came to this passage of this woman, he said she went to many doctors and they were unable to help her because, well, Luke himself was a doctor. Mark adds to that. He said she went to many doctors, used up all her money, and they only made her worse. So she comes to Jesus and touches him, and she's cured. A marvelous miracle, not only of a physical cure, but a spiritual cure as well. When Jesus gets to the house, everybody's weeping. The child's dead. And Jesus sees the situation in a different way. We could be weeping and mourning and thinking the whole world's going to hell in a handbasket. There's nothing we could do about it. Or we could rejoice in the Lord and trust in his power to resurrect even the dead. So he just goes with the mother and the father into this little girl's room. And he brings a few of his apostles. He says, little girl, get up. And she got up, and they're astonished. She says, hey, she's hungry. Give her something to eat. A very touching scene. He said, let's keep this quiet for now. And so when he went out to the mourners, he could say, see, I told you she was only asleep. And yet our culture as a whole has gone to sleep. Asleep and unconscious to the values of God. And because of that, our culture is adrift and sinking. But we don't have to go down with it because we're in that great ship, the church, that floats above it all, gives hope to the world and joy and peace to those who are willing to accept the truth of Christ.